Leave the key on the table and do not come back. My father Calvin stood at the head of our mahogany dining table, pointing a trembling finger toward the front door. This house was never yours anyway. My mother Valerie did not even flinch. She simply took another slow sip of her red wine, keeping her eyes fixed on the centerpiece she had spent 3 hours arranging. Before I could fully process the humiliation of being thrown out during Thanksgiving dinner, my younger sister Jasmine kicked a fully packed suitcase across the polished hardwood floor. It slid to a halt right at my feet. They thought they were erasing me room by room. They thought they held all the power. They had no idea my phone was about to ring with a call from the bank confirming I was now the sole owner of the very roof over their heads. My name is Zora. I am 35 years old, and my family just made the most devastating financial mistake of their lives. Before I tell you exactly how I legally evicted my own parents, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to show your toxic family that setting boundaries sometimes requires a brutal reality check. Growing up in an affluent Atlanta suburb, my family perfected the art of appearances. To the outside world, we were the picture of Black excellence. Calvin was a respected community figure, and Valerie hosted charity galas with a practiced smile. But behind the heavy oak doors of our sprawling estate, love was a transaction, and I had always been bankrupt. The Thanksgiving ambush was not a sudden explosion, but the calculated culmination of decades of favoritism. I stood in the dining room, the scent of roasted turkey and sage, stuffing souring in the air, as my suitcase bumped against my shoes. "I need the closet space for my new inventory," Jasmine said, crossing her arms. She wore a silk dress our parents had undoubtedly paid for. "My lifestyle brand is taking off, and your room gets the best natural light for my unboxing videos. You just sleep there anyway. It is not like you are actually doing anything with your life." I looked from Jasmine to my father. Calvin was gripping the edge of the table, his jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. "You have been trying to find yourself for years," Calvin said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Jasmine is building a brand. She has a vision. You are just taking up space we cannot afford to waste. You are 35 years old and still bouncing around. We are cutting the cord." I let his words hang in the air. Bouncing around. That was their narrative. They assumed I was broke because I drove a 5-year-old sedan and wore unbranded clothing around them. What I never told them was that I drove that car to my corner office downtown, where I worked as a senior vice president at a private equity firm. I stopped sharing my successes with my family a decade ago when I realized my achievements only existed to them as a means to fund Jasmine's whims or my father's bad investments. The moment I got my first promotion at 25, Calvin demanded I co-sign a loan for him. When I refused, I became the selfish daughter. So I simply stopped telling them when I won. I let them believe I was a struggling temp worker because a struggling daughter was a daughter they could not ask for money. Connor. My sister's white husband leaned back in his dining chair and swirled his expensive scotch. He wore a smug smile that made my stomach turn. He had married into our family 3 years ago and immediately adopted my father's condescending tone whenever he spoke to me. "Zora, you really should look at this as an opportunity," Connor said, adjusting his expensive watch. "The real world does not hand out free rides. Jasmine and I are scaling a massive company right now. Your parents are graciously supporting our entrepreneurial vision because they see the return on investment. You being here is a drain on their resources. Consider this an accelerated lesson in financial grit." Financial grit. The irony was almost suffocating. Connor had launched 3 different tech startups since marrying Jasmine. All 3 had failed spectacularly. I looked at my mother, hoping for a single ounce of maternal defense. Valerie carefully set her wine glass down and smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her napkin. "Listen to your brother-in-law, Zora," she murmured, not meeting my eyes. "He understands how the world works. We cannot keep subsidizing your lack of ambition. It is embarrassing. What am I supposed to tell my friends at the church gala next week when they ask why my oldest daughter is still living in her childhood bedroom? I was only staying at the house for the holiday week. I had my own place, but they had demanded I stay to help cook and clean for Thanksgiving. Now I realized the invitation was just a setup to humiliate me in front of Connor and kick me out officially. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key to the front door. I unclipped it from my key ring. I did not cry. I did not scream. Years of therapy had taught me that reacting emotionally to their cruelty only gave them the validation they craved. I tossed the key onto the mahogany table. It landed with a loud, sharp clatter against the wood. "You are right," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "This house is a drain on resources. I hope your investments pay off, Dad." I grabbed the handle of my suitcase. I maintained direct eye contact with Connor, who shifted uncomfortably under my gaze. I looked at Jasmine, who rolled her eyes and turned back to her phone. I looked at my parents, who had completely erased me from their lives simply because I refused to be their bank account. I turned and walked down the long hallway. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the pouring November rain. The door slammed shut behind me, locking me out of the only family I had ever known. The rain soaked through my coat immediately, but I did not rush. I walked to my car, loaded my suitcase into the trunk, and slid into the driver's seat. The leather interior of my car was freezing. I sat there in the dark, watching the warm light glowing from the dining room windows, where my family was undoubtedly toasting to my departure. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. The caller ID showed the name Elijah. He was the lead acquisition attorney at my firm. I swiped to answer. "Tell me you have good news, Elijah," I said, shivering as I turned on the car heater. The ink just dried. Zora Elijah's voice came through crisp and professional. "Apex Holdings has officially acquired the defaulted secondary mortgage on the Atlanta estate. The bank was thrilled to offload it. The previous owner is completely underwater." I leaned back against the headrest, a slow smile spreading across my face despite the cold. "He defaulted 3 months ago." Elijah continued reading from the file. "The primary lender was about to initiate foreclosure proceedings by Monday. You bought the debt just in time. What is your play here? Are we restructuring the terms to let them stay?" That had been the original plan. When my analysts first flagged that Calvin's property was heading for foreclosure, I had quietly moved company funds to buy the debt through Apex Holdings, a shell company I fully controlled. I had intended to absorb the loss, let them live there, rent-free, and protect my parents from losing their home. I had driven to Thanksgiving dinner planning to surprise them with the news that their house was safe. But sitting in my car soaking wet after being thrown out into the street so Connor could use my room for his failing business, the plan shifted. "No restructuring, Elijah," I said, watching a shadow move across the dining room window. "The current occupants just informed me that they believe in learning financial grit the hard way." "Understood," Elijah said. "How do you want to proceed?" "Draft the 30-day eviction notice," I ordered, my voice steady and resolute. "Have it sent by certified courier first thing Monday morning. They wanted me out of their house. Now I want them out of mine." I ended the call and pulled out of the driveway, my tires splashing through the puddles accumulating by the curb. I did not drive to a cheap motel. I merged onto the highway and drove straight downtown, pulling into the secure underground garage of the luxury high-rise building where I actually lived. The valet greeted me by name, taking my keys as I grabbed my wet suitcase. I rode the private elevator up to the penthouse suite. When the doors opened directly into my living room, I dropped the bag on the imported marble floor. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, a stark contrast to the suffocating suburban walls I had just left behind. I poured myself a glass of water and opened my laptop on the kitchen island. Elijah had already sent over the digital files. The financial autopsy of my parents' lives was laid out before me in stark black and white numbers. It was worse than I had imagined. Calvin had not just made a few bad investments, he had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on the family estate, specifically to fund Connor's tech startups. Connor had convinced my father that his new app was going to revolutionize the delivery logistics market. Instead, Connor had blown through nearly $500,000 in less than a year, paying for expensive office leases, corporate retreats, and luxury cars he claimed were necessary for the company image. When the business inevitably collapsed, Connor defaulted on the loans. Because Calvin had used the house as collateral, the bank came calling for the deed. My parents were completely broke. They had kicked me out to free up a bedroom, so Connor could launch yet another desperate business venture, hoping to strike gold before the bank seized the property. They had sacrificed their actual daughter to protect the fragile ego of their white son-in-law. My phone buzzed against the marble countertop, jarring me from my thoughts. I looked at the screen. It was a text message from Jasmine. I expected a gloating remark about me leaving, but the reality was far more audacious. Connor and I are moving my inventory into your old room tomorrow, Jasmine wrote. You left a mess. Mom says you need to send $2,000 for a cleaning and storage fee for the junk you left in the closet. Venmo works. I stared at the screen, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. They had just thrown me out into the rain and were now demanding I pay them for the privilege of being evicted. I ignored the message and tossed my phone onto the sofa. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. A notification popped up showing Valerie had left an audio message. I tapped play, leaning against the counter as my mother's voice filled the quiet penthouse. Zora, you are being incredibly immature? Valerie's voice scolded, sharp and breathless with manufactured panic. Jasmine needs that money to properly sanitize the room. If you do not send the $2,000 by tomorrow morning, I will have no choice but to tell everyone at the Black Excellence Community Gala next week exactly why you are not there. I will tell all of our friends that you had a mental breakdown, that you are an unstable burden who refused to support your sister's empire. Do not test me, Zora. Send the money. I listened to the message twice. She was threatening to publicly shame me, to assassinate my character in front of the entire community just to squeeze a few $1,000s out of me to fund Jasmine's delusions. I did not block her number. I did not call her back crying. I kept the receipts. I saved the audio file directly to my secure cloud drive. Then I logged into the Apex Holdings corporate portal. I opened the active property files and found the deed for the Atlanta estate. The system required a final executive authorization to formally transfer the title out of the bank's hands and into my company's name. I moved my cursor over the bright blue authorization button. My family had demanded I leave the key. They had demanded I take my suitcase and get out. They had told me the house was never mine. I clicked the button. The screen loaded for a brief second before a green checkmark appeared, confirming the transfer was complete. The house was no longer theirs. It belonged to Apex Holdings. It belonged to me. Another notification chimed on my tablet. Jasmine had just made a public post on social media. I opened the app to see a picture of her Connor, Calvin, and Valerie standing together on the front porch of the house. They were all smiling brightly, holding champagne flutes. The caption read, "So blessed to officially be taking over the family estate. Building generational wealth with my amazing husband and the best parents in the world. Out with the old, in with the new." Scores of family friends and church members were already commenting, praising her success, and congratulating my parents on their beautiful family. I locked my tablet and looked out over the glowing city skyline. I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. Enjoy the house, Jasmine. Take all the pictures you want. Drink the champagne and pretend you are building an empire. Because the clock is ticking, and while it lasts, you are just a guest in my home. The heavy silence in the dining room shattered when Connor leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked loudly under his weight. My sister's white husband swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. He had married into our family 3 years ago and immediately adopted my father's arrogant tone whenever he spoke to me. He adjusted his expensive silver watch, a piece of jewelry that cost more than the car parked in my driveway, and fixed his gaze on me. "Zora, you really should look at this as an opportunity," Connor said, using that practiced artificial voice he reserved for his investor pitches. "The real world does not hand out free rides. Jasmine and I are scaling a massive lifestyle company right now. Your parents are graciously supporting our entrepreneurial vision because they actually see the return on investment. You being here is a drain on their resources. Consider this an accelerated lesson in financial grit. It is time you pulled yourself up and stopped relying on family handouts. Financial grit. The sheer audacity of the phrase almost made me laugh. I stood there gripping the handle of my battered suitcase, staring at a man who was living rent-free in a house my father paid for, eating food my mother cooked, and lecturing a black woman about pulling herself up by her bootstraps. He had launched 3 different tech startups since marrying my sister. All 3 had failed spectacularly, burning through investor cash and family favors. Yet he sat there radiating pure, unearned entitlement. I bit the inside of my cheek, tasting a faint metallic tang. I looked down at my simple, unbranded wool sweater and faded jeans. I drove a 5-year-old sedan to these family gatherings on purpose. I let them believe I was a struggling, aimless temp worker bouncing between mediocre jobs. What I never told them, what Connor and his financial grit had absolutely no clue about, was that I was the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, a private equity firm that acquired and restructured distressed assets across the country. I orchestrated multi-million-dollar acquisitions before my morning coffee. My personal bank accounts held more wealth than everyone sitting at this table combined, but I kept my wealth entirely hidden from them. I learned my lesson a decade ago. The exact day I received my first major promotion at 25, Calvin had marched into my small apartment and demanded I co-sign a massive loan for a doomed real estate venture. When I refused to risk my credit for his ego, I instantly became the selfish, ungrateful daughter who abandoned her family. From that day forward, I simply stopped telling them when I won. I realized that to this family, a successful daughter was just a walking ATM, but a struggling daughter was someone they could comfortably ignore. I shifted my gaze to my mother, hoping for a single ounce of maternal defense. Valerie carefully set her wine glass down on a coaster. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her pristine silk napkin, refusing to meet my eyes. She chose the aesthetic of domestic peace over protecting her oldest child. "Listen to your brother-in-law, Zora," she murmured, her voice tight with irritation. "He understands how the corporate world works. We cannot keep subsidizing your lack of ambition. It is profoundly embarrassing. What am I supposed to tell my friends at the Black Excellence Community Gala next week when they ask why my oldest daughter is still occupying her childhood bedroom while her younger sister is building an empire?" The reality of the situation locked into place. I had only stayed at the house for the holiday week because Valerie had relentlessly guilt-tripped me into helping her prep the Thanksgiving meal. Now I realized the invitation was nothing but a calculated ambush. They brought me here to humiliate me in front of Connor, to officially kick me out, and to clear the way for Jasmine's inventory boxes. I did not scream. I did not cry. Years of harsh boardrooms and hostile negotiations had taught me that reacting emotionally to cruelty only gave the aggressor the exact validation they craved. I reached into the front pocket of my jeans. My fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy brass key to the front door. I pulled it out and unclipped it from my keyring with a sharp snap. I tossed the key onto the center of the mahogany dining table. It landed right next to the lavish turkey centerpiece with a loud final clatter. "You are right," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. "This house is a massive drain on resources. I really hope your investments pay off, Dad." I gripped the handle of my suitcase. I maintained direct, unblinking eye contact with Connor, watching the smug smile falter slightly on his face as he shifted uncomfortably under my intense gaze. I looked at Jasmine, who simply rolled her eyes and turned her attention back to her glowing phone screen. Finally, I looked at Calvin and Valerie. They had completely erased me from their lives, simply because I did not fit their shallow narrative of success. I turned my back on them. I walked down the long carpeted hallway, the wheels of my suitcase gliding smoothly over the floorboards. I reached the heavy oak front door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the freezing November night. The door slammed shut behind me, echoing like a gunshot, locking me out of the only family I had ever known. The icy rain immediately soaked through my sweater, sending sharp chills down my spine, but I did not run. I walked to my car with slow, deliberate steps. I popped the trunk, threw the suitcase inside, and slid into the driver's seat. The leather interior was freezing. The rain hammered relentlessly against the windshield, blurring the warm golden light spilling from the dining room windows of the estate. Inside, they were undoubtedly pouring more wine and toasting to my departure, celebrating the fact that they had finally gotten rid of their dead weight. I sat in the dark, shivering, but the trembling in my hands had absolutely nothing to do with the cold or with sadness. It was pure electric anticipation. My fingers gripped the steering wheel as a slow, triumphant smile spread across my face. In the cup holder beside me, my phone screen lit up, illuminating the dark cabin. The caller ID displayed a single name: Elijah, my lead acquisition attorney, right on schedule. The screen on my dashboard illuminated the dark interior of my car. The name Elijah Sterling flashed across the display. He was the lead acquisition attorney at Apex Holdings, the private equity firm I built from the ground up over the past decade. I took a slow breath, letting the cold air clear my head before pressing the answer button on my steering wheel. Elijah did not waste time with pleasantries. He never did, which was exactly why I paid him 7 figures a year. Zora. The ink is dry, he said, his voice crisp and sharp over the Bluetooth speakers. The transaction cleared the wire exactly 4 minutes ago. Apex Holdings officially holds the paper on the property. I leaned back against the leather headrest. The rain drummed a heavy, chaotic rhythm against the roof of my car. But inside the cabin, everything felt perfectly still. I looked through the rain-slicked windshield at the sprawling brick estate where my family was currently celebrating my departure. The warm, golden light spilling from the dining room windows looked inviting to anyone who did not know the toxicity breeding inside. Confirm the exact status of the primary lender I instructed, keeping my tone strictly professional. I needed to hear the reality of the situation spoken aloud to validate the move I had just made. Elijah cleared his throat, accompanied by the sound of pages turning. The primary lender was preparing to file the formal notice of default by Monday morning. Your father had missed 6 consecutive mortgage payments. The bank had already drafted the foreclosure paperwork. They were more than happy to offload the toxic debt to a private buyer. You bought the paper at a steep discount, Zora, but you still assumed a massive liability. I hope you know what you are doing. I knew exactly what I was doing. 6 months ago, my risk assessment team at Apex Holdings flagged a massive secondary loan taken out against my parents' property. The financial trail was not difficult to follow. Calvin had leveraged the only valuable asset he owned to secure a high-risk commercial loan for Connor. My father had literally bet the roof over his family's head on his white son-in-law's ability to run a tech startup. It was a spectacular display of blind faith and financial ignorance. Connor had zero experience in logistics software, but he knew how to wear a tailored suit and talk a big game. My father bought the illusion entirely. When Connor's business inevitably imploded, the debt collectors started circling. Calvin scrambled to hide the financial ruin from his country club friends. He drained his savings and maxed out his credit cards to cover the interest payments, but it was never going to be enough. The house was a sinking ship. My original intention had been purely protective. Despite the years of emotional neglect and the constant barrage of microaggressions from my parents, I could not stomach the idea of watching them get thrown out onto the street by a faceless bank. I authorized Apex Holdings to quietly purchase the defaulted debt. My plan was to assume ownership, absorb the financial loss, and allow Calvin and Valerie to continue living in the house rent-free. I was going to let them save face. I had literally driven to Thanksgiving dinner tonight to hand my father the restructured deed as a gift. But the events of the last hour had permanently altered that strategy. Sitting at that dining table watching them sneer at my supposed lack of ambition, listening to Connor lecture me about financial grit while he was secretly bankrupting my parents, I realized my family did not want my protection. They wanted a scapegoat. They needed someone to look down on so they could avoid looking at their own failures. Jasmine sliding that packed suitcase across the floor was the final push I needed to see reality clearly. Elijah interrupted my thoughts. The deed is fully transferred to the LLC, he continued, his voice echoing slightly in the car. As the new lien holder, Apex Holdings has complete discretionary control over the property. Since they are currently in default under the original loan terms, we have a few options. We can restructure the loan, extend the payment window, or forgive the debt entirely. Just say the word and I will draft the new terms for your father to sign next week. I stared through the rain at the front porch. I remembered the way my mother had carefully smoothed her napkin, refusing to meet my eyes while my father pointed toward the door. I remembered Connor swirling his expensive scotch completely unbothered by the fact that he was the actual parasite draining the family dry. They had demanded my house key. They had told me I was taking up space they could not afford to waste. "We are not restructuring, Elijah," I said. My voice was cold, precise, and devoid of any hesitation. There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear the faint sound of a keyboard clacking in the background as Elijah processed the shift in direction. "No restructuring," he repeated carefully. "Then what is the directive, Zora? Are we maintaining the current default status and letting them stay as tenants?" I watched a silhouette move across the sheer curtains of the dining room window. It was Jasmine, likely clearing away the plate I had barely touched. She was probably already mentally measuring my old bedroom for her inventory shelves. She believed she had won. She believed she had successfully ousted the family embarrassment to make room for her influencer brand. The current occupants just informed me that they believe in learning financial grit the hard way, I told Elijah. My father explicitly stated that they are cutting the cord. I am simply honoring his wishes. As the CEO of Apex Holdings, I have a fiduciary duty to maximize the value of our assets. Allowing non-paying tenants to occupy a high-value suburban estate is bad business. Elijah let out a low whistle, a sound of genuine surprise. "You are serious. You bought the debt to save them, and now you are going to drop the hammer yourself." "They made it very clear tonight that this house was never mine," I said, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. "They told me I do not belong here. I am just agreeing with them. The house belongs to the firm now." "Understood," Elijah said, shifting instantly back into his ruthless professional mode. "This is why I respect you, Zora. You do not let sentimentality ruin a clean business move." "What is the timeline?" "Draft the 30-day eviction notice," I ordered. "I want the standard boilerplate language. No special treatment. No extensions. Detail the exact nature of the default and make it explicitly clear that Apex Holdings expects the premises completely vacated by the end of the 30-day window." "I will have the legal team finalize the paperwork tonight," Elijah confirmed. "How do you want it delivered? Should I send it directly to Calvin's email?" "No," I said, a sharp edge creeping into my voice. "I want them to feel the reality of their situation. Have it sent by a bonded courier. Certified delivery. Make sure it requires a direct signature from Calvin. I want him to look a stranger in the eye and sign for his own eviction. Schedule the delivery for exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning. Let them enjoy their weekend. Let them celebrate kicking me out. Monday is when the real world knocks on their door." "Consider it done," Zora, Elijah said. "Is there anything else you need tonight? Just make sure the corporate veil on Apex Holdings remains ironclad," I instructed. "My father cannot know that I am the CEO. He cannot know that his daughter holds the deed. When he panics, he is going to start digging. He is going to call every favor he has left to figure out who bought his debt. Ensure that every public record points to a faceless corporate board. Let him fight a ghost." "The shell company structure is flawless," Elijah assured me. "To the outside world, Apex Holdings is just a ruthless private equity firm sweeping up bad debt. Your name is buried under 3 layers of corporate shielding. He will not see you coming until you decide to show yourself." "Good," I replied. "Have a good Thanksgiving, Elijah." I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. The rain was beginning to let up, leaving the suburban streets slick and shining under the streetlights. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. There was nothing left for me in that house. I drove through the quiet, manicured neighborhoods of my childhood, feeling a profound sense of liberation. For 35 years, I had contorted myself to fit their expectations. I had swallowed their insults, accepted their dismissals, and hidden my own brilliance to avoid making them uncomfortable. I had dimmed my own light so Connor and Jasmine could shine. That era was officially over. I merged onto the highway, heading toward the city's skyline. The skyline where I actually belonged. I was driving back to my reality, a reality of multi-million-dollar acquisitions, penthouse views, and absolute control. My family had spent the evening celebrating my defeat. They had no idea they had just handed me the ultimate victory. The private elevator doors opened directly into my foyer. The ambient lighting automatically adjusted to my arrival, casting a warm golden glow over the imported Italian marble floors and the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. I dropped my cheap canvas suitcase onto the plush rug. It looked entirely out of place in the middle of a penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of one of Atlanta's most exclusive high-rises. I walked over to the glass, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water from the wet bar, and looked down at the sprawling city grid. I opened the suitcase and began pulling out the oversized, faded sweaters and scuffed denim I had packed for the holiday. It was my designated wardrobe for visiting my parents. I had learned years ago that dressing well around Calvin and Valerie only invited relentless interrogations about my finances or passive-aggressive comments from Jasmine about my spending habits. I carried the clothes straight to the trash chute in the hallway and dropped them down the chute. I did not need the costume anymore. I walked into my home office and booted up my secure workstation. I tapped the screen to initiate a video call with Elijah. His face appeared on my large monitor instantly. He was sitting in his own office surrounded by glowing screens and stacks of legal briefs. Walk me through the exact timeline of Calvin's default, I instructed, pulling up the mirrored financial documents on my end. Elijah leaned into the camera, his expression deadpan. It is a textbook case of predatory proximity, Zora. 22 months ago, your father quietly took out a secondary mortgage on the estate. The property was fully paid off, but he leveraged 80% of its total equity to secure a $2.5 million commercial line of credit, and the primary beneficiary of that credit line was Connor, I stated, scanning the ledger, flashing across my screen. Exactly, Elijah confirmed. The funds were transferred through a series of LLCs directly into an operating account for a company called Nexus Logistics. That is Connor's third tech startup. The one he claimed was going to disrupt the supply chain industry. Instead, he bled the account dry in under 14 months. I scrolled through the expenditure reports. The sheer audacity of the purchases made my blood run cold. Connor had not used my father's hard-earned equity to build a software platform or hire developers. He had used it to lease a luxury office space in Buckhead, buy 2 imported sports cars under the company name, and fund lavish corporate retreats to Miami. He was playing the role of a successful tech founder, using the financial security my father had spent 30 years building. When the operating account hit zero, the business folded. Elijah continued, his voice steady. Connor filed for corporate bankruptcy, shielding his personal assets entirely. But because Calvin used the family estate as the primary collateral for the commercial loan, the bank came directly for the deed. Your father missed his first payment 6 months ago. He has been scrambling to cover the interest ever since draining his retirement accounts to keep the bank at bay. The puzzle pieces of the evening snapped perfectly into place. My parents were entirely broke. They had not kicked me out because I was taking up space. They kicked me out because they needed my bedroom to serve as the new registered business address for Connor's next fraudulent venture, hoping he could secure another round of angel investments to save the house. They had sacrificed their own daughter, throwing me into the rain to protect the bruised ego and the fraudulent lifestyle of their golden son-in-law. They handed him everything, I said, my voice low and dangerously steady. They gave him the keys to the kingdom and he burned it down. And instead of holding him accountable, they threw me out to make room for his ashes. Calvin trusted a mediocre man with a failing business plan over his own flesh and blood simply because Connor looked the part. The foreclosure was inevitable, Elijah said, softening his tone just a fraction. If Apex Holdings had not purchased the debt, the sheriff would have been changing their locks by the end of the month. You bought them time, Zora. Time they chose to spend humiliating me, I replied, closing the financial ledger. Prepare the eviction notice, Elijah. I want the paperwork spotless, no procedural errors. When we strike, I want it to be absolute. It will be ready for your signature in the morning, he promised before disconnecting the call. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair staring at the blank monitor. The silence of the penthouse was absolute. There was no chaotic shouting, no passive-aggressive remarks echoing down the hallway. I had built a fortress of absolute security entirely on my own. I had clawed my way to the top of the financial sector, fighting past every systemic obstacle facing a black woman in private equity, while my family actively bet against me. I stood up and walked into my master bedroom. The space was enormous, featuring a custom walk-in closet filled with tailored designer suits and a king-sized bed overlooking the glowing city lights. I stripped off the damp clothes from the evening and stepped into the marble shower, letting the scalding water wash away the lingering tension of the Thanksgiving ambush. When I stepped out and wrapped myself in a heavy cotton robe, I felt a profound shift in my spirit. The lingering guilt, the small, desperate part of me that still wanted to save my parents from their own catastrophic mistakes, was entirely gone. They had made their choice. They had chosen the illusion of Connor's success over the reality of my presence. I was done trying to rescue people who actively wanted to see me drown. I walked back into the kitchen to pour a glass of wine. Just as my hand touched the stem of the crystal glass, my phone buzzed violently against the marble countertop. The harsh vibration shattered the quiet peace of the room. I picked up the device. The screen displayed a new text message from Jasmine. I swiped to open it, expecting perhaps a hollow apology or a fake pleasantry to maintain appearances now that the dust had settled. Instead, the message was a masterclass in sheer unadulterated entitlement. "Connor and I are moving my inventory into your old room tomorrow," the text read. "You left a mess. Mom says you need to send $2,000 for a cleaning and storage fee for the junk you left in the closet. Venmo works." I stared at the glowing screen. I read the words again, letting the magnitude of their delusion wash over me. They had literally just thrown me out of my childhood home into a rainstorm. And now, less than 2 hours later, my sister was demanding I pay them $2,000 for the privilege of being evicted so she could move her worthless inventory into my space. I did not type a response. I did not even grant her the satisfaction of a typing bubble appearing on her screen. I simply swiped the notification away and left Jasmine on read. I set my phone face down on the cool surface of the marble island and picked up my wineglass, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive Cabernet. The audacity was almost clinical in its perfection. They were so deeply conditioned to treating me as their personal emotional punching bag and financial safety net that they truly believed I would just roll over, apologize, and open my wallet. They had spent my entire life writing a script where I was the perpetual loser, and they were so committed to the narrative that they could not see the reality staring them in the face. A few minutes later, the phone began to vibrate violently against the stone surface, spinning slightly from the force of the incoming call. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dim lighting of the kitchen. Valerie. My mother was calling to play the enforcer. She always stepped in when Jasmine did not immediately get what she wanted. I watched the screen glow. I did not reach for it. I let it ring. Once, twice, 4 times. Finally, the screen went dark. Less than a minute later, a new notification popped up indicating a voicemail. I tapped the screen and pressed play, projecting the audio through the high-fidelity speakers wired throughout the penthouse. My mother's voice filled the massive room, not with the sweet, practiced tone she used at her charity events, but with the sharp, venomous cadence she reserved exclusively for me behind closed doors. "Zora, you are being incredibly immature," Valerie scolded her breath, hitching with manufactured panic and genuine rage. "Jasmine needs that money to properly sanitize the room and clear out the mess you left behind. We are all making sacrifices for this family, and your selfish behavior tonight is a slap in the face. If you do not send the $2,000 by tomorrow morning, I will have no choice but to take matters into my own hands. Do you hear me, Zora? I will tell everyone at the Black Excellence Community Gala next week exactly why you are not there. I will stand in front of our friends, the pastors, and the board members, and I will tell them that you had a complete mental breakdown. I will paint you as an unstable burden who refused to support her own sister's empire because of petty jealousy. I will ruin your reputation in this city before you even have a chance to build one. Do not test me, Zora. Send the money." The message ended with a sharp digital click. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not oppressive. It was completely clarifying. Any lingering fragment of daughterly obligation I might have subconsciously harbored evaporated into the conditioned air of my penthouse. She was perfectly willing to assassinate my character, to completely fabricate a narrative about my mental health, and to label me an unstable burden to her affluent social circle, just to extort a couple of $1,000s to fund Jasmine's delusions. This was the woman who had birthed me, weaponizing my own existence to protect the fragile ego of her youngest daughter. Years ago, a message exactly like that would have sent me into a desperate spiral of anxiety. I would have cried until my eyes were swollen. I would have drafted a dozen different apologies trying to explain my side of the story. I would have ultimately transferred the money just to keep the fragile peace and avoid the crushing public humiliation she was threatening. But I was not that scared little girl anymore. I did not shed a single tear. I did not block her number, and I certainly did not reach for my banking app to authorize a transfer. Instead, I tapped the screen and downloaded the audio file. I uploaded it directly to my secure encrypted cloud drive, saving it in a designated folder meticulously labeled with my family's financial and personal records. I had learned very early in my corporate career that you never throw away leverage. You catalog it, you index it, you wait for the exact right moment to deploy it. I left my wine glass on the counter and walked back into my home office. The panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sea of gold and white lights. But my focus was entirely on the high-resolution monitors glowing on my desk. I sat down in my chair and pulled the mechanical keyboard forward. I logged out of my personal accounts and launched the secure VPN portal for Apex Holdings. The system required a strict two-factor biometric authentication. I pressed my thumb to the scanner and watched the corporate dashboard load. The interface was cold, efficient, and stripped of any emotion. It was just data, liabilities, assets, and acquisitions. It was the world where I held absolute power. I navigated to the active property files and typed the address of the suburban estate into the search bar. The system pulled up the dossier instantly. There it was. The sprawling brick house I had grown up in, reduced to a string of digital coordinates, tax identification numbers, and defaulted loan status indicators. I opened the property transfer protocols. Elijah had already queued up the necessary legal frameworks, just as we discussed. The deed assignment was fully drafted, waiting in the administrative holding queue for final executive sign-off. The screen displayed the current ownership details. Calvin and Valerie's names sat at the very top of the digital document, tethered to a mountain of toxic, unpayable debt. Directly below their names was the assignee field, brightly highlighting Apex Holdings, LLC. I stared at the screen, analyzing the stark reality of the data. My parents had spent their entire adult lives cultivating an image of impenetrable wealth and superior social status. They had built their entire identities around the square footage of that house, the pristine landscaping, and the exclusive zip code it resided in. They looked down on everyone who did not meet their impossible aesthetic standards, especially their own oldest daughter. And yet their entire existence was currently hanging by a thread inside a corporate server farm, waiting for my final command. They thought they held all the power. They thought throwing me out into the rain was the ultimate assertion of their dominance. They had no idea that they were completely broke, entirely leveraged, and absolutely at my mercy. I moved my cursor over the bright blue authorization button at the bottom of the screen. The system prompted a final confirmation dialog box. It warned that executing this command would officially and irrevocably transfer the deed from the primary lender to Apex Holdings, initiating the final legal stages of the asset seizure. I thought about Connor swirling his expensive scotch and lecturing me about the real world while he actively drained my parents' bank accounts. I thought about Jasmine crossing her arms and demanding money to clean a room she was essentially stealing. I thought about Valerie's venomous voicemail promising to destroy my name at a charity gala funded by the very credit cards they were actively defaulting on. And I thought about Calvin standing at the head of the mahogany table, pointing his trembling finger at the front door, and telling me that the house was never mine anyway. He was wrong. I clicked the button. The screen loaded for a brief fraction of a second. A green check mark appeared in the center of the monitor, confirming the transfer was absolute. The progress bar filled, indicating the deed was officially registered under the new corporate ownership structure. The house was no longer theirs. It belonged to Apex Holdings. It belonged entirely to me. I picked up my phone and drafted a quick encrypted message to Elijah. "The authorization is complete. Release the documents." Elijah replied less than a minute later. "The eviction notice is queued for Monday morning delivery by courier. Enjoy your weekend, Zora." I locked my workstation and walked back to the expansive windows. The city looked different now. It looked like a massive chessboard, and I was finally moving my pieces with lethal precision. My family wanted to play a ruthless game of status and wealth. They wanted to use me as a pawn to fund their delusions. Now the board was completely flipped, and the 30-day countdown had officially begun. I did not need to send $2,000. I did not need to defend myself against Valerie's petty socialite gossip. I just needed to wait for the sun to rise on Monday morning. I took a deep breath of the cool, quiet air inside my penthouse. For the first time in my entire life, I was genuinely looking forward to our next family interaction. The green confirmation checkmark on my secure monitor faded into the background as the system finalized the transaction. The digital ledger updated instantly. The deed to the sprawling suburban estate in Atlanta was wiped completely clean from the bank's distressed asset portfolio. It now resided safely within the heavily encrypted server infrastructure of Apex Holdings. I did not just own their debt. I owned the very ground they were standing on. I reached across my mahogany desk and hit the print command. My heavy-duty office printer whirred to life in the corner of the room, spitting out the crisp, high-resolution documents. I always kept physical copies of my most significant acquisitions. There was something profoundly satisfying about holding the tangible proof of my success in my own hands. As I stood up to retrieve the paperwork, the screen of my tablet illuminated on the edge of the desk. A push notification slid across the locked display. Jasmine had just made a new public post on Instagram. I picked up the tablet and unlocked it. I tapped the notification, expecting another passive-aggressive quote about cutting out toxic energy or a highly filtered selfie, showing off the outfit she bought with my father's dwindling credit limit. I was completely unprepared for the sheer scale of the delusion staring back at me. The photograph was impeccably staged. The rain must have briefly paused, or they were standing deep beneath the shelter of the massive front portico. Jasmine Connor. Calvin and Valerie were clustered together on the front steps of the house. They were all holding crystal champagne flutes raised high toward the camera in a triumphant toast. Jasmine was positioned front and center, wearing a smug, glowing smile. She had already changed out of her silk dinner dress into a designer loungewear set. Connor stood beside her with his arm draped possessively over her shoulder, flashing that same entitled grin he had worn while lecturing me about financial grit just hours earlier. Behind them, my parents looked like the absolute picture of proud, affluent black excellence. Calvin was grinning broadly, and Valerie leaned into him, radiating manufactured joy. I stared at the image, letting the absolute absurdity of the scene wash over me. They were celebrating in front of a house that was legally scheduled for foreclosure on Monday morning. They were drinking expensive champagne while their bank accounts hovered near zero. They were toasting to a future that did not exist. I scrolled down to read the caption. Jasmine had written a small novel heavily decorated with sparkling emojis. So blessed to officially be taking over the family estate. Building generational wealth with my amazing husband and the best parents in the world. We have such massive plans for this property. The new headquarters for our lifestyle brand is going to be iconic. Out with the old and in with the new. Out with the old and in with the new. She was talking about me. I was the old that had been discarded to make room for her empty cardboard boxes and her failing influencer ambitions. I tapped the comments section. It was already overflowing with praise from our affluent suburban community. Scores of family friends, church members, and local business owners were eagerly feeding into Jasmine's carefully constructed lie. Aunt Patricia had commented first. "So incredibly proud of you, Jasmine. You and Connor are building such a beautiful empire. Your parents must be thrilled to pass the torch." A woman from my mother's charity board added her own praise. "Beautiful family. Generational wealth is so important. Congratulations on the new headquarters." I scrolled through dozens of similar comments. Not a single person questioned how a couple with 3 failed startups and no actual income was taking over a massive estate. Not a single person asked where the oldest daughter was. My family had successfully curated an echo chamber of enablers who applauded their aesthetic while remaining entirely blind to their reality. I walked over to the printer and pulled the freshly printed deed from the tray. The paper was heavy and warm to the touch. I carried it back to the kitchen island and set it down next to my tablet. I leaned over the marble counter, looking back and forth between the digital photograph of my family celebrating their stolen victory and the physical legal document proving their absolute ruin. This was not the first time Jasmine had attempted to claim my achievements as her own. It was a pattern that had defined our entire relationship, actively encouraged by Calvin and Valerie. When I was 23, I worked 80-hour weeks at an entry-level financial firm to save enough cash to buy my first reliable car. It was nothing flashy, but it was mine and I bought it entirely in cash. The very weekend I brought it home, Jasmine demanded to borrow it for a weekend trip with her friends, claiming her car was making a weird noise. When I refused, Calvin stepped in. He took my keys from the kitchen counter and handed them to her. He told me I was being selfish and that family shared their resources. Jasmine took my car for an entire week. She drove it to Miami. She posted dozens of photos posing on the hood, acting like she had purchased it herself. Her followers praised her success, and she soaked up every single compliment without ever mentioning my name. When she finally returned the car, the interior was trashed and the rear bumper was heavily scratched. When I demanded she pay for the repairs, Valerie told me to stop being so dramatic and let my sister have her moment. They had always treated my hard work as raw material for Jasmine's comfort. They believed my sole purpose was to act as the invisible scaffolding supporting their fragile public image. But a car was a minor inconvenience compared to a multi-million-dollar estate. I zoomed in on Connor's face in the photograph. He was looking directly into the camera lens with absolute confidence. This was the man who had convinced my father to leverage his life savings on a ghost company. Connor had walked into my father's house, taken his money, ruined his credit, and then had the sheer audacity to sit at my father's dining table and tell me that I was the drain on resources. He truly believed his proximity to my family's perceived wealth made him invincible. He believed his mediocre business ideas were brilliant simply because my father was foolish enough to fund them. Connor and Jasmine were planning to use the estate as the backdrop for their lifestyle brand. They were going to film unboxing videos in my old bedroom and host networking events on the back patio. They were going to monetize the very walls of the house pretending they owned the bricks while the actual owner was watching them through a glowing screen miles away. They were completely untethered from reality. The mortgage was in severe default. The property taxes had not been paid in over a year. The utility companies were likely days away from issuing shut-off notices. Yet they were smiling and drinking champagne because they genuinely believed their own lies. They believed that if they projected success fiercely enough, the universe would somehow bend to accommodate them. I tapped the screen and refreshed the feed. The likes were still climbing. Jasmine was actively replying to comments soaking up the unearned admiration. "Thank you so much, Aunt Patricia," she wrote. "Connor and I have been working so hard for this. We are so excited for the next chapter." I set the tablet down and picked up the physical deed. I ran my fingertips over the crisp black ink detailing the transfer of the title. I looked at the bottom of the page where the embossed seal of Apex Holdings sat like a heavy anchor. It was the only truth that mattered. Social media likes and country club gossip could not stop a legal eviction. Generational wealth was not built on Instagram captions and stolen bedrooms. It was built on cold, hard leverage. My parents had traded my loyalty for an illusion. They had thrown me out into the rain to protect a son-in-law who was actively bankrupting them, and a daughter who cared more about aesthetics than reality. They had demanded I leave my key on the table and told me the house was never mine. I picked up my pen from the desk and signed my initials on the intake log attached to the deed. I felt a profound sense of closure. The anxiety and the lingering desire for their approval that had haunted me for 35 years were completely gone. I was no longer the discarded daughter. I was the landlord, and they were my severely delinquent tenants. I looked at the photograph on the tablet one last time. I studied their smiling faces perfectly frozen in their moment of manufactured triumph. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already vanished. I smirked, tracing the raised seal on the legal deed sitting on my kitchen island. Enjoy the house, Jasmine, while it lasts. The annual Black Excellence Community Gala was the undisputed crown jewel of Atlanta's affluent suburban social calendar. Hosted in the grand, gold-leafed ballroom of the city's most historic luxury hotel. It was a night designed purely for the projection of status and the illusion of power. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars cast a warm, flattering light over dozens of tables draped in heavy white silk and adorned with towering, fragrant floral centerpieces. This was the arena where local reputations were aggressively cemented, where quiet, predatory deals were struck over $1,000 plates of seared filet, and where my parents, Calvin and Valerie, had spent decades pretending to be suburban royalty. I stepped out of the tinted back window of my hired black town car and handed my coat to the awaiting valet. For the past 10 years, I had deliberately and successfully avoided this specific event. When I did attend in my mid-20s, bowing to relentless family pressure, I wore off the rack clearance dresses and kept my head bowed, playing the submissive part of the struggling, aimless daughter my mother so desperately needed me to be. Tonight, the heavy, suffocating costume was gone. I was dressed in a floor-length emerald green silk gown, custom-made by an independent designer I frequented in Milan. It featured no flashy logos, no ostentatious sequins, and no desperate cries for attention. It was the absolute epitome of quiet, dangerous luxury, tailored to perfection, and draped elegantly over my frame. A single flawless diamond tennis necklace rested coolly against my collarbone. I did not look like a temp worker desperate for a handout. I looked exactly like what I was, a corporate predator. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open and I stepped inside. The low melodic hum of a live jazz quartet was nearly drowned out by the clinking of champagne glasses and the low murmur of aggressive networking. I paused at the top of the grand staircase overlooking the expansive floor. Heads immediately began to turn. Conversations trailed off into confused whispers as people noticed the woman standing at the entrance. I recognized faces from my childhood church elders, local politicians, and wealthy business owners who had always looked at me with thinly veiled pity. Their eyes swept over me now, trying to reconcile the vision of wealth and absolute confidence radiating from the top of the stairs with the pathetic, unstable narrative my mother had undoubtedly spun about my life. I kept my posture impossibly straight, my expression pleasantly neutral, and began my descent down the velvet-lined steps. I scanned the massive room. It did not take long to locate my family. They were seated at a prime VIP table right near the front stage, a placement Calvin likely secured by maxing out his absolute last remaining credit card. My father was holding court, laughing loudly with a local real estate developer, projecting the image of a man who was not secretly drowning in commercial debt. Jasmine was busy posing for photos in a sequined dress that looked entirely too desperate for the occasion, forcing smiles for her social media feed. Connor stood beside her, holding a crystal glass of scotch, aggressively pitching what I assumed was his next fraudulent business idea to an older, wealthy-looking couple. And then there was Valerie. My mother was seated in the center of the table, a permanent practiced smile plastered on her face as she nodded along to someone's story. She turned her head to signal a passing waiter, and that was when her eyes locked onto mine across the crowded room. The transformation was glorious to witness. The manufactured warmth vanished from her face in an instant, replaced by a stark, visceral panic. The color drained from her cheeks so fast she looked physically ill. I watched her hand grip the edge of the table, her knuckles turning bone white against the linen tablecloth. She blinked rapidly as if trying to banish a sudden hallucination. But I was not a mirage. I was walking directly toward their table, every step deliberate and measured. Valerie frantically tapped Calvin on the shoulder. He turned his boisterous fake laugh dying in his throat the second he saw me navigating through the crowd. He stood up so quickly, his chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. They moved with a synchronized, desperate urgency. Calvin and Valerie intercepted me halfway across the ballroom, effectively acting as a physical barricade between me and their prized VIP table. Valerie reached out and grabbed my bare forearm, her manicured nails digging sharply into my skin. Her grip was meant to be punishing a physical assertion of control she had utilized to keep me in line since I was a teenager. "What in the world are you doing here, Zora?" Valerie hissed, keeping her voice low and tight to avoid drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. Her eyes darted around the room with frantic, paranoid energy. "You are not invited to this table. You are not a sponsor." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her fingers until she felt the sheer cold authority radiating from my silence. She slowly released her grip, her hand dropping awkwardly to her side. "I am a member of this community, Valerie," I replied, my voice smooth and completely untroubled. I thought it was time I finally made an appearance and showed my face. "You look ridiculous," Calvin muttered, stepping closer to block my path entirely. He glared at my gown, completely miscalculating its worth. "Renting a designer dress you cannot afford to crash an event you do not belong at. This is exactly the kind of unstable behavior your mother warned everyone about. We told our friends you were going through a severe mental health crisis. You showing up here looking for attention only proves our point." Valerie leaned in closer, the scent of her expensive floral perfume clashing heavily with the sour smell of her nervous sweat. "You need to turn around and walk out those double doors right now," she demanded, her tone laced with raw, desperate venom. "Connor is at our table speaking with two of the most prominent angel investors in Atlanta. He is securing funding for his new venture. The last thing he needs is his deadbeat sister-in-law showing up and embarrassing the family. You are a walking liability, Zora. Do not ruin his networking opportunities because you are bitter and jealous of your sister." I stood perfectly still, absorbing the sheer, unadulterated delusion pouring out of their mouths. They were standing in a ballroom, drowning in a mountain of commercial debt they could not pay mere days away from a brutal legal eviction. Yet they were still prioritizing the fragile ego of a white son-in-law who had literally bankrupted them over the presence of their own daughter. They were genuinely worried that I would ruin Connor's chances of scamming another investor out of their money. "Are you deaf, Zora?" Calvin growled, his face flushing with quiet anger. "I said leave. You are an embarrassment." An embarrassment. The word echoed in my mind. For decades, that word had been a heavy, suffocating chain around my neck. It was the primary weapon they used to keep me small, to ensure I never outshone the carefully curated family image. But standing there, possessing the absolute power to dismantle their entire lives with a single phone call, the word meant absolutely nothing to me. I looked at Calvin. I looked at the man who had leveraged his legacy on a lie. Then I looked at Valerie, the woman who would gladly sacrifice my sanity to protect her social standing. "I am not going anywhere," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that I usually reserved for hostile board meetings and corporate takeovers. "And if you attempt to touch me again, Valerie, I promise you the scene I cause will be the only thing this community talks about for the next 10 years. Valerie gasped, taking the reflexive step backward. Calvin's jaw dropped in stunned silence. They were entirely unprepared for my lack of compliance. They expected me to shrink, to apologize, to scurry away into the night in shame to avoid a public dispute. They did not know how to process a Zora who held her ground. I did not wait for them to recover from their shock. I stepped around Calvin, my silk gown brushing against his tuxedo leg. I walked past them with the effortless grace of someone who owned the very ground they walked on. I could feel their panicked eyes burning into my back, but they did not dare follow me or raise their voices. The suffocating fear of public embarrassment kept them frozen in place. I glided toward the VIP table. Jasmine spotted me first. Her eyes widened, her mouth parting in a silent gasp as she took in my appearance. She looked down at her own flashy dress, a sudden flash of profound insecurity crossing her face as she compared herself to me. Connor was completely oblivious to the rising tension. He was leaning across the table, aggressively gesturing with his hands as he spoke to a wealthy older gentleman. And that is exactly why our new logistics platform is going to completely revolutionize the regional supply chain, Connor was saying, his voice oozing with unearned, arrogant confidence. We are looking for visionary partners who understand that explosive growth requires bold, unhesitating capital. The older investor looked mildly skeptical, swirling his drink as he politely endured the pitch. I reached the table. There was an empty chair directly beside Connor, likely reserved for Calvin. I did not ask for permission. I reached out, grabbed the back of the heavy velvet-lined chair and pulled it out. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor, instantly cutting off Connor's monologue. Connor spun around, his face morphing from practiced charm to sheer, unadulterated shock. "Zora," he stammered, his eyes darting from me to the empty space where my parents used to be standing. "What are you doing here?" I sat down gracefully, smoothing the fabric of my emerald gown over my knees. I looked at the wealthy investor, offering a polite, radiant smile before turning my gaze slowly to my brother-in-law. I rested my forearms on the table, projecting absolute terrifying calm. "I think I will stay for dinner." The entire table fell dead silent. The lively hum of the Black Excellence Community Gala seemed to evaporate in our immediate radius. The jazz quartet continued to play an upbeat tempo in the background, but no one at our VIP table or the adjacent tables was listening to the music anymore. The surrounding guests were completely captivated by the brutal forensic dismantling of Calvin's golden son-in-law. Connor turned the color of chalk. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He looked as though all the air had been violently sucked from his lungs. His mouth hung open slightly, but no words came out. His hands, which had been gesturing so confidently just moments before, now rested flat and trembling against the white linen tablecloth. He stared at me with wide, primal panic. He realized in that exact second that I was not a struggling, aimless temp worker. He realized I had seen the actual bank ledgers. He realized that I knew exactly where every single financial body was buried down to the specific routing numbers and fraudulent corporate tax filings. Arthur Pendleton, the wealthy angel investor, slowly set his crystal glass down on the table. The ice clinked softly against the sides. He looked at Connor with an expression of profound, chilling disgust. Arthur did not yell or make a scene. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his bespoke tuxedo, pulled out the sleek embossed business card Connor had enthusiastically handed him earlier, and deliberately tore it in half. He dropped the torn pieces onto his dessert plate. He stood up, buttoned his jacket without looking at any of us, and walked away from the table. Connor watched his last desperate chance at a financial lifeline disappear into the crowd. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. Jasmine was no longer laughing. Her sequined dress suddenly looked cheap and ridiculous under the massive chandeliers. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She looked frantically at Connor, waiting for him to unleash a brilliant defense to shut me down and put me back in my place. But Connor remained entirely mute, staring at the torn business card on the plate. I sat back in the heavy velvet chair and folded my hands neatly in my lap. I smoothed a non-existent crease from my emerald silk gown. I looked up at my parents, who were still hovering behind me. Valerie was clutching her chest. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Her absolute worst nightmare had just materialized in the center of the gold-leafed ballroom. Her pristine, carefully curated social standing had been publicly slaughtered. It had not been ruined by a vicious rumor or a petty family argument. It had been dismantled by raw, undeniable financial data, broadcasted to the exact people she spent her entire life trying to impress. Calvin looked physically ill. The boisterous, confident patriarch who had pointed a trembling finger at me on Thanksgiving was gone. He looked down at me, his eyes darting nervously to the surrounding tables, where his country club peers were openly whispering and staring. He knew that by tomorrow morning, the entire suburban elite would know that he had leveraged his family estate to fund a tax-dodging shell company. I looked back across the table directly into Connor's pale, terrified face. I let a slow, satisfied smile touch the corners of my mouth, so I asked, my voice perfectly calm and pleasant, "What time do you need me at the warehouse on Monday?" The silence at the VIP table was thick enough to suffocate a person. Connor was still staring at the empty space where the wealthy angel investor had just been standing moments before. He blinked rapidly, trying to process the catastrophic collapse of his networking pitch and the tearing of his expensive business card. He slowly turned his gaze back to me. His jaw tightened. The panic in his eyes was quickly replaced by a desperate performative arrogance. He needed to reassert his dominance, and he needed to do it immediately before the whispers from the neighboring tables grew any louder. Connor let out a sharp, condescending chuckle. He adjusted his silk tie and leaned back in his velvet chair, attempting to look like the magnanimous patriarch. "You always did know how to make an entrance, Zora," he said, his voice carrying intentionally to the eavesdropping guests nearby. "Look, I know things have been hard for you lately. Valerie told us you were struggling to find your footing in the real world. We are family, and family takes care of each other. I am actually expanding my operations next week. I need a warehouse assistant to manage the lower-level inventory. The pay is entry-level minimum wage, but it is an honest start. I would be willing to offer you the position if you promise to keep your emotions in check and actually show up on time." Jasmine let out a high-pitched theatrical laugh. She leaned into Connor, placing a manicured hand on his chest. "Oh my goodness, Connor, you are entirely too generous." She giggled loudly, ensuring the surrounding tables could hear her mock me. "But honestly, I do not think she is qualified to manage a warehouse. She cannot even manage to keep her own apartment without begging us for help." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply picked up my water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down on the pristine linen tablecloth. "A warehouse assistant for Nexus Logistics." I asked, my tone conversational, but laced with absolute ice. Connor's condescending smile froze. A tiny muscle in his jaw twitched. "How do you know that name?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. I ignored his question. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. The same Nexus Logistics that burned through a $2.5 million commercial line of credit in under 14 months. I continued, articulating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. The same credit line secured by an 80% equity leverage on my father's supposedly fully paid-off estate. The ambient noise in our section of the ballroom instantly vanished. The clinking of silverware stopped. The wealthy socialites at the adjacent tables were suddenly very still, hanging on to my every word. "Shut your mouth," Zora Valerie hissed from behind me, her voice trembling with absolute terror. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Connor. "Did you tell your investors about the 3 shell companies you incorporated in Delaware?" I asked, leaning in closer. "Did you tell them how you funneled that $2.5 million through Apex Solutions, Blue Ridge Holdings, and Zenith Capital to mask the cash flow from the IRS? Did you show them the fraudulent vendor invoices you created in Nevada? Or the lease agreements for the 2 imported sports cars you acquired under the corporate tax ID right before you declared corporate bankruptcy to shield your personal assets from federal auditors?" Connor turned the color of chalk. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost in a tailored tuxedo. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He realized in that exact second that I was not guessing. I was not repeating gossip. I was reciting pure cold data. I knew exactly where every single financial body was buried. Jasmine looked at Connor, her confusion masking her earlier arrogance. "Connor, what is she talking about?" she whispered. but he could not even look at her. His eyes were wide with primal panic. "That is enough." Calvin's voice exploded across the ballroom. He slammed his heavy fist down on the table, rattling the crystal glasses and overturning a silver salt shaker. He stepped around the chairs, pushing his way to the front of the table. His face was a dark, mottled red, his chest heaving with uncontrolled fury. He had spent decades building the illusion of immense wealth, and I had just dismantled it in front of the entire Black Excellence Community Gala. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly in my face. "You are a jealous, bitter woman," Calvin roared, entirely abandoning the quiet dignity he usually projected. "You have spent your entire pathetic life trying to tear down your sister because you cannot stand to see her succeed. You cannot stand that she found a brilliant man and built a life while you have absolutely nothing to show for yourself." People from across the ballroom were openly staring now. Several security guards lingered near the perimeter, unsure if they needed to intervene. Valerie grabbed Calvin's arm, trying desperately to pull him back, to silence him before the social damage became irreparable, but he shoved her hand away. His pride had been mortally wounded, and he needed a victim. "You come into this room dressed in clothes you cannot afford, trying to humiliate my son-in-law," Calvin shouted, his voice echoing over the jazz quartet. "Connor is 10 times the business mind you will ever be. You think you know something about my finances. You think you can intimidate me in front of my peers with your fabricated numbers. You are nothing, Zora. You are a failure." He leaned down, bracing his hands on the table, his face inches from mine. "You want to talk about the family estate?" he sneered, his breath hot and ragged. "Let me make this perfectly clear for you and everyone listening. I am going to my attorney's office first thing tomorrow morning. I am signing the deed of that house entirely over to Jasmine and Connor, every single brick, every blade of grass. It belongs to them. I am completely writing you out of my will, Zora. When I die, you will get absolutely nothing. You will never set foot in that house again." The silence that followed his massive tirade was absolute. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for my reaction. They expected me to cry. They expected me to shatter under the weight of my father's brutal public rejection. I slowly stood up from the velvet chair. I smoothed the front of my emerald silk gown with immaculate calm. I looked down at my father. He looked so small to me now. He was just a hollow, angry man, desperately clinging to an empire of dust and debt. I leaned in my face, inches from his. I dropped my voice to a venomous, icy calm, ensuring only the 4 people at the table could hear my final words. "You cannot sign over a house you no longer own, Dad." Calvin froze. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of pure confusion piercing through his rage. "Check your mailbox at 8 in the morning," I whispered softly. I did not wait for his response. I did not look at Connor's chalk-white face or Valerie's terrified, trembling hands. I simply turned around and walked out of the ballroom. The sea of wealthy socialites parted for me instantly, stepping aside as I glided toward the exit, leaving my family completely and utterly paralyzed in my wake. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, casting sharp geometric shadows across the polished glass surface of my desk. The atmosphere inside the executive suite of Apex Holdings was always perfectly regulated. It was silent, climate-controlled, and entirely insulated from the chaotic noise of downtown Atlanta sprawling hundreds of feet below. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The digital clock on my secondary monitor read exactly 8 o'clock. My assistant had already placed the morning briefing files in a neat stack next to my keyboard, but I did not touch them. My entire focus was centered on the sleek black smartphone sitting face up on the glass desk. At exactly 8 o'clock, a bonded legal courier in a sharp gray suit was scheduled to walk up the pristine concrete driveway of my parents' suburban estate. He would bypass the decorative fountain ring, the doorbell, and hand-deliver a thick, sealed manila envelope directly into my father's hands. The envelope contained no pleasantries. It contained a certified notice of ownership transfer, a finalized deed reassignment, and a legally binding 30-day notice to vacate. I watched the digital numbers on my monitor shift. 801, 802, 803. I pictured Calvin waking up in his massive master bedroom, still nursing a mild hangover from the cheap champagne he had celebrated with over the weekend. I pictured him walking to the front door wearing his silk robe, expecting perhaps a package for Valerie or another useless piece of inventory for Jasmine's imaginary lifestyle brand. I pictured the exact moment his arrogant smile would falter as he ripped open the heavy seal and read the bold black letters declaring his absolute financial ruin. At exactly 8:05, the black smartphone vibrated violently against the glass. The screen illuminated the quiet office. The caller ID flashed brightly. Calvin. I did not reach for it immediately. I sat perfectly still, watching the device spin slightly from the force of its own vibration. I let it ring once. I let the sound bounce off the quiet walls of my corporate fortress. I let it ring twice. 3 times. 4 times. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted the cold, terrifying reality of his situation to fully sink into his bones before he heard my voice. On the 5th ring, I reached out and tapped the green icon, sliding the phone across the glass and placing it on speaker. I did not say a word. I simply let the line open. Zora! Calvin's voice exploded through the high-fidelity speaker. There was no greeting. There was no attempt at his usual booming patriarchal dominance. His voice was entirely stripped of its manufactured authority. It was thin, high-pitched, and shaking with raw, unadulterated panic. Zora, are you there? Pick up the phone right now. I am here, Dad. I replied, my voice smooth, even, and completely devoid of emotion. You need to listen to me very carefully. Calvin commanded, his breathing heavy and ragged. He sounded like a man who had just run a marathon in a tailored suit. Something is happening. Something is very wrong. A man just came to the door, a process server. He handed me a stack of legal documents. I do not even understand what I'm looking at. They are claiming the house is gone, Zora. They are claiming the bank sold the deed. He paused, gasping for air. In the background, I could hear a high-pitched wailing sound. It was Valerie. My mother was sobbing hysterically, completely abandoning her refined country club persona. The sound of her despair was a chaotic symphony playing out in the foyer of a house she no longer owned. They say we have 30 days to vacate, Calvin continued, his voice cracking under the sheer weight of the words. 30 days. They are threatening to send the county sheriff to physically remove our belongings and change the locks. This has to be a mistake. This has to be some kind of massive administrative error at the bank. I have been communicating with my loan officer. We were negotiating a restructuring plan for Connor's credit line. They cannot just seize the property without warning. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool glass desk. The bank does not negotiate with defaulted commercial debt, Dad, I stated calmly. When you leverage 80% of your home equity to fund a shell company, and that company declares bankruptcy, the collateral is automatically forfeited. The bank liquidates the asset to recoup their losses. This is not a mistake. This is standard operating procedure. It is a mistake, Calvin roared, slamming his hand against something hard on his end of the line. The loud thud echoed through my office. Connor's business is experiencing a temporary cash flow issue. We just need an extension. We just need to get in front of the right people and explain the logistics platform. Where is Connor right now? I asked, resting my chin on my folded hands. There was a brief, hesitant silence on the line. He is in the guest room, Calvin muttered defensively. He is making calls. He is reaching out to his venture capital network to secure emergency bridge funding. I almost laughed. Connor was not securing funding. Connor was hiding. He was likely sitting on the edge of the guest bed, frantically deleting emails and trying to figure out how to shield his own personal bank accounts before the corporate auditors froze everything he touched. He had thrown my father entirely to the wolves, and Calvin was still desperately trying to protect him. Look, I did not call you to discuss Connor's business strategy. Calvin snapped, his tone shifting from panic back to his default state of aggressive condescension. The documents state that the primary lender sold the debt to a private equity firm, some faceless corporate entity called Apex Holdings. They bought the paper entirely in cash on Friday afternoon. They bypassed the standard foreclosure auction completely. He paused, his breathing loud and erratic through the speaker. You work in the financial sector, Zora. You spend your life sitting in a cubicle looking at spreadsheets. You know these corporate scavengers. I need you to use whatever mediocre finance connections you have and find out who runs this company. I sat perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the Atlanta skyline. I need a name. Zora, Calvin demanded, his voice rising with desperate entitlement. I need a phone number. I need you to get me directly to the CEO of Apex Holdings. I will sit down with them. I will explain the situation. I will offer them a structured repayment plan with a premium interest rate once Connor's new funding clears. I just need you to pull some strings and get me in the room. This is your family. This is your mother's home. You need to fix this. The absolute audacity of the man was breathtaking. Less than 48 hours ago, he had stood at the head of his dining table and ordered me out into a rainstorm. Less than 12 hours ago, he had pointed his finger in my face at a charity gala and called me a jealous, bitter failure. He had looked me in the eyes and gleefully promised to write me out of his will so that I would inherit absolutely nothing. And now, facing total annihilation, he expected me to utilize my professional network to act as his personal savior. He was demanding that I beg a faceless corporation for mercy on his behalf, completely and entirely oblivious to the fact that he was already speaking to the executioner. How much do you owe, Dad? I asked, my voice dropping an octave. What does it matter? Calvin deflected, his pride still fiercely battling his terror. Just find the contact information. I need to hear you say the number I instructed, refusing to yield an inch of ground. If you want me to leverage my professional reputation to beg a private equity firm for a stay of eviction, I need to know the exact scale of the liability. How much of your equity did Connor burn through? $2.5 million. Calvin practically spat the words out, his voice vibrating with rage. 2.5 million in principal, plus 300,000 in accrued penalties and default fees. Now do your job and find me the CEO of Apex Holdings. I slowly reached out and picked up the smartphone, lifting it off the glass desk. I disabled the speakerphone and pressed the cool metal edge of the device directly against my ear. I listened to the sound of his ragged breathing. I listened to the muffled, frantic cries of Valerie echoing in the background. I listened to the total destruction of their manufactured empire. You do not need to look for the CEO of Apex Holdings. Dad, I said, my voice a venomous whisper of absolute authority. What are you talking about? Calvin snapped, his confusion temporarily overriding his panic. You told me I would never set foot in that house again. I continued, ignoring his question entirely. You told me I was a failure who did not understand how generational wealth worked. You told me I was entirely written out of your future. Zora, what is wrong with you? Calvin demanded. Why are you bringing this up right now? We are losing the estate. I am bringing it up because you are right, Dad. I replied, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across my face. You cannot leave me the house in your will. You cannot sign the deed over to Jasmine and Connor to protect your legacy. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, allowing the tension to pull tight like a wire across the digital connection. You cannot sign over a house you no longer own. The line went completely dead silent. The heavy, frantic breathing stopped. Even Valerie's sobbing in the background seemed to instantly cease as the sheer impossible magnitude of my words hit him. I am the CEO of Apex Holdings, I stated, delivering the final lethal blow with surgical precision. I bought your debt in cash on Friday afternoon. I authorized the transfer protocols while you were drinking champagne at the gala. That house belongs to me, and your 30-day countdown started the second you opened that envelope. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button terminating the call. I set the device face down on the desk, picked up my black coffee, and turned back to my quarterly reports. My coffee had barely touched my lips when the smartphone violently vibrated against the glass surface of my desk. The sharp, buzzing sound echoed through the cavernous silence of my executive suite. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller ID flashed brightly with Calvin's name. I set my ceramic mug down and simply watched the device spin slightly from the force of its own vibration. His reality distortion field was so incredibly thick that his brain had instantly rejected the truth. To Calvin, I was the perpetual disappointment. The idea that I was the chief executive officer of the private equity firm holding his literal eviction notice was a mathematical equation his deeply ingrained narcissism simply could not solve. He had likely convinced himself in the span of 30 seconds that I was throwing a bitter childish tantrum to punish him for the charity gala. I let it ring a second time, then a third. By the fourth ring, I could practically envision the veins bulging in his neck as he paced the hardwood floors of his foyer. On the fifth ring, I reached out and tapped the green icon, bringing the phone back to my ear. "Do you think this is a game, Zora?" Calvin roared, his voice cracking with a chaotic mixture of raw panic and manufactured outrage. "Do you think this is funny? I am standing here holding a 30-day notice to vacate my property, and you are making sick delusional jokes about owning Apex Holdings. You are a mid-level corporate drone who rents designer dresses to crash parties you are not invited to. Now stop acting like a petulant child and listen to me." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his denial. For a fleeting second, I considered hanging up again and letting the sheriff deal with him in 30 days. But then a much more devastating strategy materialized in my mind. He was handing me a golden opportunity on a silver platter. By refusing to believe my authority, he was keeping the door wide open for an interrogation. If I maintained my aggressive posture, he would eventually hang up and hire a desperate strip mall attorney to fight the eviction. But if I pivoted to his expectations, I could extract a full, unadulterated confession. I could get the entire anatomy of their fraud on the permanent record. I reached out and pressed a discreet silver button on the base of my desk phone, activating the corporate call recording software. A tiny red light blinked to life, confirming that every single word Calvin spoke from this second forward was being permanently archived in the Apex Holdings legal database. I softened my posture and intentionally dropped my voice to a higher anxious register, perfectly mimicking the scared, obedient daughter he had trained me to be. "You are right, Dad," I said, forcing a slight tremor into my tone. "I am sorry. I was just so angry about how Valerie treated me at the gala last night. I was just trying to hurt you because I felt humiliated. But you are right. This is serious. I will help you. I can talk to the senior partners at my firm and see if they have any back-channel contacts at Apex Holdings to stall the eviction." I heard a heavy, ragged sigh of relief echo through the speaker. "I knew you would snap out of it," Calvin muttered, his tone instantly returning to its default state of arrogant condescension. "We are family, Zora. We protect our own. Your mother is currently hyperventilating in the kitchen. We need this resolved quietly and immediately before the neighborhood association gets wind of it." "I can only help if you tell me the absolute truth, Dad," I said, leaning forward and staring intently at the blinking red light. "My firm cannot negotiate a stay of eviction blindly. Private equity groups do not seize primary residential estates over a simple missed commercial payment. They only execute an immediate 30-day notice to vacate if there is proof of severe financial negligence. What did Connor actually do with the $2.5 million? Calvin hesitated. The line was quiet, save for the sound of his heavy, irregular breathing. He was weighing his options. He was trying to decide if he could still maintain the illusion of Connor's brilliance or if he needed to finally throw his golden son-in-law to the wolves to save his own skin. The survival instinct of a cornered narcissist always wins. "That worthless, arrogant little boy," Calvin hissed, his voice dropping into a venomous sneer. "There was no logistics platform, Zora. There was no revolutionary supply chain software. It was a complete, unmitigated lie." I kept my voice perfectly steady, playing the shocked, naive listener. "Where did the equity go, Dad? How do you lose $2.5 million in 14 months? Crypto," Calvin spat the word out like it was a mouthful of ash. He took the entire line of credit. He took $2.5 million of my hard-earned equity, and he dumped it into an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency liquidity pool. He told me it was a guaranteed return. He showed me these elaborate spreadsheets and projected yield graphs. He said we would double the investment in 3 weeks and pay off the initial mortgage entirely. He said we would build generational wealth. And he lost it, I prompted, guiding him effortlessly through the confession. He lost every single penny, Calvin roared, the anger finally breaking entirely through his fear. The exchange was a complete scam. The servers were wiped clean less than 48 hours after he wired the funds. The money evaporated into thin air, Zora. There is absolutely nothing left. The shell companies he set up in Delaware and Nevada were just dummy corporations designed to funnel the cash without triggering federal tax flags. He is a fraud. My entire legacy is gone because I trusted a fast-talking boy with a fake Rolex. I felt a cold wave of absolute vindication wash over my chest. I had always known Connor was a parasite, but the sheer scale of his incompetence was truly staggering. He had not even failed at a legitimate business venture. He had literally handed my parents' entire net worth to an anonymous internet scammer. And Jasmine, I asked, carefully maneuvering the conversation toward my sister. Did she know about the crypto scam? Did she know the money was completely gone? Of course she knew, Calvin groaned, sounding utterly exhausted by the weight of his own family's deception. She has known for 6 months. She is the one who convinced me to keep it a secret from your mother. Jasmine begged me to give Connor more time to fix it. She said if he could just get another round of seed funding from local angel investors, he could day trade his way out of the deficit and restore the account balances before the bank noticed the missed payments. The puzzle pieces clicked together with devastating clarity. Jasmine was not just a naive, spoiled princess blindly supporting her husband. She was a fully conscious, active participant in the destruction of our family estate. She had stood in the kitchen and demanded $2,000 for a cleaning fee, while fully aware that the ground beneath her feet was already foreclosed. "Is that why you kicked me out of the house, Dad?" I asked, my tone stripping away the obedient daughter facade just enough to let the cold reality bleed through. "Is that why you threw me into a rainstorm and told me I was a drain on your resources?" Calvin swallowed hard. "We needed your bedroom, Zora," he admitted, his voice shrinking into a pathetic, guilty murmur. Connor needed a new, clean residential address to register a fresh series of LLCs. He needed to establish a home office to apply for emergency federal small business relief loans to try and cover the mortgage interest. We could not have you living there asking questions and occupying space we desperately needed to run the recovery operation. We had to get you out. They had literally rendered me homeless to facilitate a desperate illegal cover-up. They had treated me like disposable trash to protect a fraudulent scheme that was doomed to fail. Any microscopic shred of empathy I might have subconsciously harbored for the 2 people who raised me was permanently incinerated in that exact moment. I stared at the blinking red light on my desk, knowing that their entire conspiracy was now legally and permanently documented. "Please, Zora," Calvin begged, his voice cracking completely. "You are the only one who can fix this. I know we have been hard on you. I know things have been tense. But you have to use your connections. You have to find a loophole in this eviction notice. If you save the house, I promise you can move back into your old room. We will put the past behind us. Just tell me what you need me to do." I smiled. It was a sharp, predatory expression that did not reach my eyes. "I need you to forward me the exact eviction notice you received from the courier, Dad," I instructed, keeping my tone brisk and deliberately professional. "Send it to my personal email right now. I cannot approach the partners at my firm without seeing the exact legal statutes Apex Holdings is using to claim the deed. I need to review the paperwork to find your loophole." "I am sending it right now," Calvin replied frantically, his fingers tapping loudly against his phone screen. "I'm taking a photo of the document and emailing it to you this very second. Check your inbox, Zora, please. We only have 30 days. I opened my email client on my secondary monitor and waited. Less than 10 seconds later, a new message popped into my inbox from Calvin's personal address. The subject line was blank. The attachment was a high-resolution photograph of the exact 30-day notice to vacate that I had personally drafted and signed with my own fountain pen just 48 hours ago. I clicked on the image to expand it. The crisp black text filled my screen. There was my signature resting proudly and undeniably at the bottom of the page directly above the printed title, identifying the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings, LLC. "I see it, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a velvet, terrifying whisper. "I have the document right in front of me." "Read it," Calvin pleaded, oblivious to the shift in my tone. "Read the fine print, Zora. Find the mistake. Find the loophole. Who do we need to sue to get my house back?" I leaned back in my leather chair. I had the entire confession meticulously documented and safely stored on a corporate server. I had absolute, undeniable proof of their fraud, their complicity, and their total financial ruin. The game was entirely over, and I had won the board. "I will review every single word very carefully," I promised. The high-resolution PDF loaded onto my secondary monitor with a crisp digital snap. I stared at the stark black and white document illuminating the quiet, regulated space of my corner office. It was a masterpiece of corporate legal drafting. Every single clause was airtight. Every statute was perfectly cited and cross-referenced. I had paid an entire floor of ruthless corporate attorneys, an exorbitant retainer, to ensure this specific piece of paper was entirely impenetrable. It was a certified notice of ownership transfer, a finalized deed reassignment, and a legally binding 30-day notice to vacate. On the other end of the open line, Calvin was still talking. The initial shock of his confession had given way to a pathetic, rambling monologue. He was weeping. The great patriarch who had commanded every room he ever entered, who had dictated the terms of my entire existence with an iron fist, was openly sobbing into his smartphone. He was babbling incoherently about his legacy. He kept repeating how hard he had worked to build his standing in the community. He was frantic about the optics of his failure. "You do not understand what this will do to me, Zora," Calvin pleaded, his voice thick with mucus and panic. "I built this family name from nothing. Arthur Pendleton saw me at the gala last night. The entire board of directors was at that table. If this eviction goes public, my country club membership will be revoked immediately. I will be a laughingstock. The community board will demand my immediate resignation. You have to understand the social mechanics of this disaster. I cannot be seen as a man who lost his estate to a faceless private equity firm." He was completely detached from the reality of his own actions. Even now, actively facing the loss of his home and the total destruction of his finances, he was framing himself as the victim of a cruel, unfeeling universe. He was prioritizing his country club membership over his family's actual survival. He blamed the offshore crypto exchanges. He blamed the aggressive venture capitalists who had supposedly pressured Connor. He even blamed the overall state of the national economy. He blamed absolutely everyone and everything, except the greed and arrogance that had driven him to leverage his family's shelter for a fraudulent get-rich-quick scheme. "Are you reading the document, Zora?" Calvin demanded, his voice rising to a frantic squeak. "Are you looking at the clauses? There has to be a grace period. There has to be a mandatory arbitration phase for commercial debt reassignment in this state. You work with these kinds of massive corporate contracts. Tell me where the mistake is. Tell me how we freeze the 30-day clock. I will hire whoever you recommend. I will drain my remaining retirement accounts to pay their retainer. Just stop the sheriff from coming." I did not answer him immediately. I moved my ergonomic mouse across the glass desk and clicked the print icon on my screen. Across the room, my heavy-duty commercial laser printer hummed to life. The mechanical whir of the machine processing the data felt incredibly loud in the pristine silence of my executive suite. I stood up from my leather chair, smoothing the invisible creases from my tailored slacks. I walked slowly across the plush carpet, the sound of my heels muffled by the expensive weave. I pulled the freshly printed document from the output tray. The paper was heavy stock, and it was still warm from the toner. The sharp scent of hot ozone drifted into the air. I walked back to my desk and laid the paper flat on the polished glass surface. I looked down at the bottom of the page. I looked directly at the final execution line. It was blank. The legal courier had delivered the finalized notice to Calvin exactly as instructed, but state foreclosure laws required the physical authorizing signature of the purchasing entity's chief executive officer to execute the final 30-day countdown. The document Calvin was holding in his trembling hands was technically a notification of intent. The document currently sitting on my desk was the loaded gun. It was a legal formality my attorneys had insisted upon to ensure absolute flawless compliance with local eviction statutes. Zora, please. Calvin begged, the desperation in his voice escalating rapidly as the silence on the line stretched out. Tell me you found something. Tell me you are sending this file to your senior partners. I am begging you. Do not let them take my home. I opened the top right drawer of my glass desk. Inside, resting on a bed of dark molded velvet, was a heavy brushed titanium fountain pen. It was a bespoke piece I had purchased for myself the exact day I officially incorporated Apex Holdings. I picked it up, feeling the cool, substantial weight of the metal in my palm. I unscrewed the cap deliberately, taking my time listening to the faint metallic scrape of the threads. I looked at the blank line, waiting for my name. This was the exact moment the power dynamic permanently shifted. This was not a verbal threat thrown across a dining room table. This was not a heated argument in a rainstorm. This was the cold, hard, irreversible machinery of the law. By signing this piece of paper, I was legally authorizing the county sheriff to arrive at my parents' suburban estate in exactly 30 days to physically remove them from the premises. I was turning my father into a trespasser in his own home. And Jasmine, my beautiful, perfect sister, who had stood by and laughed while they threw me out of the front door. She would be standing on the curb next to her fraudulent, terrified husband, watching a moving crew box up her designer clothes and cheap cardboard. They had kicked me out to run a criminal enterprise from my bedroom. They had stripped me of my family to protect a pathetic financial lie. Zora, answer me, Calvin demanded, his voice cracking completely, losing all pretense of dignity. Are you there? What does the document say? Is there a loophole we can exploit? I pressed the titanium nib of the fountain pen against the heavy stock paper. I pressed down firmly, letting the dark midnight blue ink bleed into the page. I signed my name with bold, sweeping, unmistakable strokes. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or hesitation. I felt absolutely nothing but the pure, crystalline clarity of total victory. I drew a sharp, definitive line under my signature, finalizing the execution as the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings. I blew gently on the wet ink, watching it dry into a permanent dark matte finish. I placed the cap back on the titanium pen and set it down carefully on the glass desk. I picked up the signed document and walked over to the high-speed commercial scanner sitting on my side credenza. I fed the heavy paper into the machine and pressed the glowing blue activation button. The scanner pulled the document through with a swift mechanical zip, instantly converting my physical signature into a secure, encrypted digital file. I walked back to my desk and sat down in my leather chair. A notification popped up on my primary monitor, confirming the scan had been successfully routed to my secure inbox. I opened Calvin's original email, the one where he had desperately pleaded for me to save his crumbling empire. I clicked reply. I dragged the newly scanned PDF with my bold signature sitting squarely on the final execution line and dropped it directly into the attachment field. I am looking at the document right now, Dad, I said, my voice perfectly calm and entirely devoid of any familial warmth. I am looking at the fine print. I am looking at the final execution clause at the bottom of the page. What does it say? Calvin gasped, his breath catching in his throat. The sound of Valerie weeping had grown substantially louder in the background. Tell me what it says, Zora. Tell me how we stop them. I moved my fingers to the mechanical keyboard. I did not type a long emotional explanation. I did not outline his failures or mock his incredible, staggering stupidity. I did not mention Connor's crypto scam or Jasmine's complicity. I simply typed a single definitive sentence into the body of the email. There is no loophole. See you in court. I moved the cursor over the send button. I clicked it. The email vanished from my screen, instantly hurtling through the digital void back to the terrified man pacing in his foyer. I reached out and pressed the red icon on my desk phone. The line went dead. I hung up the phone. Exactly 60 minutes after the phone line went dead, the private executive elevator in the lobby of Apex Holdings chimed. I had specifically instructed the ground floor security desk to let them pass without issuing guest badges. I wanted them to ride the glass elevator up 40 stories. I wanted them to watch the city of Atlanta shrink beneath their feet as they ascended into my domain. The polished steel doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. Calvin led the charge, his face a mask of manufactured suburban fury. He was followed closely by Valerie, Jasmine, and Connor. They marched out of the elevator bay and straight into the sprawling expanse of my executive suite. The room was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the skyline. Dark mahogany panels lined the walls, and a massive slab of black tempered glass served as my desk. I was sitting perfectly centered behind it, my hands neatly folded over a thick red legal folder. Calvin stopped so fast that Valerie crashed into his back. Connor's jaw literally dropped. Jasmine let out a strange, strangled gasp. I watched their brains completely short-circuit. They had stormed a corporate fortress expecting to find a faceless white-collar predator ready to negotiate a real estate deal. Instead, they found the daughter they had thrown away like garbage sitting on a throne of undeniable power. Connor recovered first. His fragile ego simply could not process being outplayed by a woman he had spent years mocking. He stepped around Calvin, puffing out his chest and attempting to project the aura of a successful venture capitalist. "This is a cute stunt, Zora," Connor sneered, his voice echoing sharply in the large room. "But you drastically overplayed your hand. I am calling my attorneys right now. You are operating an unlicensed shadow equity firm. I am suing you for predatory lending practices and illegal asset seizure. By the time I am done with you in court, you will be begging to clean the floors in this building." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached out and pressed the silver intercom button on my glass desk. "Marcus, please bring the team in," I said. The heavy mahogany doors to my left opened immediately. 4 men and 2 women in immaculate bespoke suits walked in, flanking my desk with predatory stillness. My lead corporate litigator, a former federal prosecutor, stared Connor down with absolute deadpan silence. I slid the thick red folder across the black glass of my desk. "Sue me," I asked, my voice a lethal whisper. "Let us talk about the secondary loan you took out against the house, Connor." Connor stared at the red folder as if it were a live grenade. His fake confidence shattered instantly, leaving him looking small and terrified. Jasmine suddenly turned incredibly pale, clutching the strap of her designer handbag like a lifeline. I opened the folder and flipped to the second page. "When you lost the initial $2.5 million in that offshore crypto scam, you panicked," I explained, projecting my voice so every syllable hit them like a physical blow. "You ran out of equity. The bank froze your commercial line. You needed immediate liquid cash to hide the deficit from the auditors. But you could not use your own names because your credit profiles were already flagged for catastrophic default." I looked directly at my sister. "So Jasmine got creative. You assumed I was just a struggling nobody. You assumed I had no resources, no credit monitoring, and no legal protection. You forged my signature on a $150,000 personal loan using my social security number, which you stole from Dad's old tax records." Valerie let out a piercing shriek. She realized in that exact moment that her perfect golden child was not just spoiled, she was a documented felon. To stop the conversation and protect her favorite daughter, Valerie immediately resorted to her ultimate weapon. She grabbed her chest, leaning heavily against Calvin, and began taking loud, ragged, theatrical gasps of air. "I cannot breathe!" Valerie wailed, her knees buckling slightly as she clutched the fabric of her expensive blouse. "Calvin, my heart. Get a doctor. She is killing me. My own daughter is giving me a heart attack." I picked up my smartphone. I did not hesitate. I dialed 911 and put it on speakerphone, setting the device down on the glass desk. The emergency dispatcher answered immediately. I gave them my corporate address and requested emergency medical services for a suspected panic attack. Then I added a secondary request. I asked the dispatcher to route the call to the Financial Crimes Division, noting that the perpetrators of a high-level identity theft were currently contained in my office. The medical response team stationed in my building's lobby arrived in under 3 minutes. They rushed in, checking Valerie's vitals, her pulse, and her oxygen levels. Within seconds, the lead paramedic stood up, looking entirely unamused. "Her vitals are perfectly normal," the paramedic stated flatly, looking at Calvin. "She is not having a cardiac event. It is a fabricated stress response." Valerie's fake gasping instantly stopped. She glared at the paramedic, her face flushed with extreme embarrassment. But before she could launch into a defensive tirade, the private elevator chimed again. 2 uniformed police officers from the Atlanta Fraud Division stepped off the elevator, their hands resting casually on their duty belts. They walked past the paramedics and looked directly at me. I stood up from my desk, smoothing my tailored slacks. I looked at my sister, whose perfectly manicured hands were now shaking uncontrollably. I did not just call the paramedics, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute finality across the executive suite. "I called the fraud division. Hand over your wrists." Jasmine burst into hysterical tears. She backed away, bumping into the glass wall and shaking her head in violent denial. The officers moved in swiftly, grabbing her arms and pulling them behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoed like a gunshot in the silent office. Connor lunged forward, trying desperately to leverage his country club privilege to stop the arrest. "Officers, hold on a second," Connor said, holding his hands up and using his smoothest sales voice. "There is a massive misunderstanding here. My wife is a respected member of the community. We have top-tier legal representation. You cannot just come in here and arrest her based on the word of a disgruntled family member." The taller officer did not even look at him. He simply reached out and took the red folder my lead litigator offered him. "The IP address used to originate the fraudulent loan matches your home network, sir," the officer stated, glancing at the heavily documented paper trail. "The transferred funds were deposited directly into an account registered to your wife's maiden name. The paper trail is absolute. Step back right now or you will be charged with interfering with an active arrest." Connor physically recoiled, his false bravery evaporating into thin air. He watched in stunned, terrified silence as they began reading Jasmine, her Miranda rights, right in the middle of my office. Calvin watched his entire golden empire shatter into dust. The illusion of his wealth, his prestige, and his perfect family was completely destroyed. He stumbled forward, bracing his hands on the edge of my glass desk. His eyes were red and filled with genuine, desperate tears. "Zora, please," Calvin begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "She is your sister. She is family. Please drop the charges. Tell them it was a mistake. If you do this, I swear everything will change. You can come home. I will give you your room back. You can live with us rent-free." I looked around my immaculate executive suite. I looked at the imported mahogany, the panoramic view of the city, and the team of elite corporate lawyers waiting silently at my command. I looked down at the man who had called me a failure less than 24 hours ago. "I own the building we are standing in." "Dad," I said, my voice dripping with cold, unyielding reality, "I do not need a childhood bedroom." The officers turned Jasmine around and guided her toward the elevator. Her sobbing was loud and pathetic, a sharp contrast to the arrogant laughter she had weaponized against me for my entire life. As she was led away, Connor stopped at the threshold of the elevator doors. He turned back, his face twisted with pure venomous hatred. His entire life was over and he knew it was entirely my doing. "This isn't over, Zora." Connor spat, his voice shaking with impotent rage. I smiled. It was a slow, satisfied, predatory smile. I sat back down in my leather chair and folded my hands neatly on the glass desk. "You are right, Connor," I replied, my voice ringing clear and steady across the room. "You still have 29 days to vacate my property." The 29 days passed with the mechanical precision of a ticking clock. I did not accept a single phone call from my parents. I ignored every frantic text message. I routed every desperate email directly to my legal department. They had spent my entire life dictating the terms of my existence, and now they were trapped in a countdown they could not manipulate or control. On the morning of the 30th day, the Atlanta air was crisp and completely clear. I pulled my black SUV up to the edge of the sprawling suburban estate at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Two marked county sheriff vehicles were already parked idly by the decorative stone fountain, with their hazard lights flashing a silent warning to the quiet, affluent neighborhood. I stepped out of my vehicle, smoothing my tailored cashmere coat. The immaculate manicured lawn that Calvin had obsessed over for decades was now a chaotic graveyard of cheap cardboard moving boxes and hastily packed garbage bags. A rented yellow box truck was backed aggressively over the pristine flower beds, cracking the decorative stones. It was a pathetic, undignified display. The grand illusion of the Wilson family empire had been dragged out into the daylight and reduced to a pile of disorganized clutter. I walked up the sweeping concrete driveway. The lead sheriff, a tall man with a stern professional demeanor, nodded to me and checked his clipboard to confirm my identity. He stepped aside, allowing me a clear view of the porch. Jasmine was sitting on a taped-up box of designer shoes near the garage. She was wearing oversized gray sweatpants and a stained t-shirt. Her perfectly maintained hair was tangled and dull. A bulky black GPS ankle monitor was strapped tightly above her bare heel. She was out on bail, waiting for her federal fraud indictment. Connor was completely absent. The moment he realized the sheer magnitude of the criminal charges he was facing, he had abandoned his wife, emptied whatever hidden cash reserves he had left, and fled the state. He was currently a fugitive running from federal marshals, leaving Jasmine to face the entire legal fallout completely broke and entirely alone. Calvin and Valerie emerged from the front door carrying a heavy wooden dining chair between them. They stopped dead in their tracks when they saw me standing at the bottom of the porch steps. The physical deterioration of my parents over the last month was startling. Calvin looked like a deflated balloon. His shoulders were rounded, his face was lined with deep gray exhaustion, and the arrogant fire that usually burned in his eyes had been completely extinguished. Valerie looked incredibly fragile. Her carefully maintained country club glamour was entirely stripped away, leaving only a terrified, aging woman staring at the wreckage of her social standing. They set the wooden chair down on the concrete. The sheriff stepped forward, resting his hand comfortably on his utility belt. "You have exactly 10 minutes remaining to clear the premises," the officer announced, his voice booming across the yard. "Anything left inside the structure after that time will be considered abandoned property." Valerie began to weep. It was not the theatrical performative crying she had used in my office. It was a quiet, broken, deeply hollow sound. She stepped away from the chair and walked slowly toward the edge of the porch, looking down at me. "Zora, please," Valerie whispered, her voice trembling and raw. "We have nowhere else to go. The apartment we rented is barely big enough for the boxes. We are your parents. We gave you life. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood." Calvin stepped up beside her, resting a shaking hand on the wooden railing. He did not yell. He did not point his finger. He looked at the ground, unable to meet my eyes. "Zora, I built this house." Calvin mumbled, his voice lacking any of its former booming resonance. "I put every ounce of my sweat into these walls. You cannot just take it and throw us out like strangers. We made mistakes, but we are family. Please show some mercy." I stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at the exact spot where they had humiliated me just a few short months ago. I remembered the freezing rain soaking through my thin jacket. I remembered the heavy trash bags filled with my belongings hitting the wet pavement. I remembered Calvin standing over me, telling me I was a parasite and a failure, while Jasmine laughed from the warmth of the doorway. I felt the cool wind coming off the street, and I felt absolutely no pity in my heart. "You did not give me life, Valerie," I stated, my voice cutting through the crisp morning air with razor-sharp clarity. You gave me a series of impossible conditions to meet, and when I stopped serving your ego, you discarded me. I shifted my cold gaze to Calvin. You did not build a legacy, Dad. You built a house of cards, and you handed the matches to a con artist. You gambled your entire reality on the illusion of prestige, and you lost the bet. I checked my heavy titanium watch. The 30th day had officially arrived. I looked back up at the two broken people standing on my porch. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I delivered the words with the precise, devastating cadence of an executioner, ensuring they mirrored the exact phrasing he had used against me on Thanksgiving night. Leave the key, take your suitcases, and do not come back. Calvin squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear escaping and tracking down his weathered cheek. He reached into the pocket of his slacks, pulled out the heavy brass key, and set it gently on the wooden porch railing. He turned around, took Valerie by the arm, and guided her down the steps toward the rented moving truck. Jasmine stood up from her box of shoes, refusing to look at me as she trudged toward the passenger side, dragging her heavy ankle monitor across the driveway. I stood silently next to the sheriff and watched my family climb into the cab of the battered yellow truck. The engine sputtered to life, groaning loudly under the weight of their remaining possessions. They drove slowly down the street, turning the corner and disappearing from my life forever, heading toward a cramped, dismal apartment and a mountain of federal legal debt. The moment the truck vanished from sight, I turned my attention back to the massive colonial estate. I did not sell the property. Liquidating it would have been the easy, predictable corporate move. I had a much grander vision for the space that had once served as a monument to Calvin's toxic, exclusionary ego. Within 24 hours, a fleet of commercial contractor vans lined the driveway. I had the entire interior of the house gutted down to the studs. We ripped out the dark, oppressive mahogany panels, the gaudy gold fixtures, and the heavy velvet curtains. We knocked down walls to open up the floor plan and installed massive skylights to flood the space with natural sunlight. I transferred the deed into a newly established nonprofit trust fully funded by the philanthropic arm of Apex Holdings. The Wilson estate was officially transformed into the Vanguard Financial Incubator. It became a fully subsidized housing facility and dedicated elite workspace exclusively designed for young, ambitious Black women entering the high-stakes financial sector. Where Calvin had hoarded wealth to project a fake image of superiority, I created a sanctuary designed to generate actual lasting economic power. We brought in elite corporate mentors, established dedicated high-speed fiber optic trading desks in the former formal dining room, and built a comprehensive scholarship program for women who had the brilliant analytical minds but lacked the traditional institutional access. 3 months later, the massive renovation was entirely complete. I walked through the freshly painted halls, the air smelling of clean linen and bright ambition. I could hear the confident, energetic voices of the first cohort of young women discussing market trends and equity portfolios in the main collaborative space below. I walked slowly up the main hardwood staircase and opened the door to my old bedroom. The room where I had frantically packed my bags in the dark while listening to my family laugh was now a bright, modern private office reserved for the program's leading scholar. I stepped inside and stood by the window looking out over the sprawling green lawn. The heavy, suffocating weight of my childhood was completely gone. It had been systematically dismantled and replaced with purpose. I had taken the physical site of my deepest trauma, the very foundation of my family's betrayal, and successfully turned it into a permanent living monument of Black female empowerment. I placed my hand against the cool window glass and took a deep, steady breath of the quiet air, finally and completely at peace. The greatest lesson we can learn from this story is that blood does not automatically make someone family, and shared DNA is never an excuse for abuse. True security does not come from waiting for approval from those who are determined to misunderstand you. It comes from building your own foundation, setting unbreakable boundaries, and recognizing your absolute value. When you stop shrinking yourself to fit into toxic dynamics, you reclaim your true power and create a life that is authentically yours. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? Share your story down below today.